You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. By going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com, you can make this possible. All right, folks, there are more people running for president on the Democratic side than there are weigh-ins. Yeah, say it ain't so. One of the folks is Beto O'Rourke, of course. He ran for the United States Senate, lost to Senator Ted Cruz, got within 2.5 points of upsetting him. That has caused a lot of his supporters to say he can make a real run for the presidency. Well, earlier this morning, he and I had a conversation. We talked about a variety of things, including his plan to register more than 50 million voters and make sure that an additional 35 million folks can vote in 2024. Here's our conversation. Well, first off, welcome to Roland Martin Unfiltered. Congressman Beto O'Rourke, how are things in your world?
Things are great. I'm in Atlanta. We just had a voting rights forum last night. I'm going to get a chance to meet Stacey Abrams today, a little bit later today. I'm really looking forward to that on this same subject. And then have a chance to speak to a group later this evening before moving on to Iowa tomorrow. So grateful to be in Georgia.
Let's talk about that particular issue. You've unveiled your voting rights platform, your issue that you have laid out. This is something that I have been obviously focused on for a number of years. The reality is that on the Republican side, there's this constant focus to suppress the vote all across the country, whether we're talking about Georgia, whether we're talking about Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, especially in North Carolina. And I say that this is, without a doubt, the plan and strategy of the National Republican Party, because they do not want to see black folks, young folks vote. They want to be able to shrink the population in order to maintain power.
That's absolutely right. And I would add my home state of Texas to that list.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm also a native of Texas, so you're right. Texas is there as well.
Yeah, we ranked 50th in voter turnout before 2018, and that was because of the tactics that you just described. The state legislature literally drew people out of congressional districts based on their race or ethnicity. The courts found that to be the case in 2017. In Texas, you can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at the ballot box, but you cannot use your student ID at Prairie View A&M or the El Paso Community College to prove who you are at the ballot box. But we saw a lot of people in 2018 transcend those barriers. And in fact, young voter turnout in early voting was up 500%. You had one of the greatest levels of turnouts in a midterm election year in the history of the state of Texas. So there's a way to overcome this through people's organization and willingness to volunteer and get after it. But you've got to institutionalize that. And so our plan calls for bringing in 50 million new voters over the next 4 years, bringing 35 million new people to the polls who not just registered but are actually voting over that same time period, and then removing the barriers to voting. So stopping the purges of voter rolls that we've seen in those states that you've just described, perhaps most notably here in Georgia, making sure that there are no more discriminatory voter ID laws or racial gerrymandering, and then guaranteeing the sanctity of the ballot box, having paper ballots and or paper receipts, having full audits of all the elections that take place, and then making sure that we get big money out of our politics and have people just respond to other people, not PACs, not corporations, not special interests. If we do all of that within the frame of a new Voting Rights Act, then this democracy is going to fully function, and we're going to be able to meet those big challenges, whether it's immigration or economic inclusion, healthcare, or confronting climate before it's too late.
But how do you speak to, and this is the space where I think it is the missing link. How do you speak to white voters to get them to understand that? And let me unpack that. A couple of years ago, I was at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation annual legislative conference, and it was all the civil rights leaders. It was Secretary of State, the state of California. And I said, look, I said in 2016, there was a clerk in Wisconsin who specifically said she moved a voting location off of a college campus because too many young folks were voting, and she moved it to a far-out place with a small parking lot. What took place in North Carolina, removing those voting locations off of those campuses. Wisconsin, some 200,000 people were affected by that voter ID law. Even though the Obama administration, they approved it, their voter ID law in terms of the DOJ, federal judge had to pull in Governor Scott Walker and say, why y'all foot dragging these voter IDs? And I think every time we talk about voting, in many ways, we're talking about African Americans, Voting Rights Act, and pre-clearance, but young white voters, older voters as well, are being targeted. And when I said to civil rights groups, you've got to tell white Americans, look, this ain't a black thing. Your voting rights are also being impacted. And I think that's also a disconnect there.
Absolutely. I think you just made the case, and I think we could continue by saying it's not just the elections that are compromised. It is the policies that follow. So if Stacey Abrams were the governor of Georgia, you would have no new anti-choice legislation being signed that restricts a woman's ability to make her own decisions about her own body. Now, that affects women of color, but it also affects white women in this state. You might find some common cause in the policies that follow fraudulent elections like the one that was held in Georgia. Or you mentioned North Carolina, where I think fraud is the right word to use in a congressional district where the will of the voters was subverted. And thankfully, they're going to redo that election. I think the Democrats going to win if there is a level playing field. So I think you're absolutely right to say that we've got to find the common cause that makes this not just an issue important to communities of color, but an issue to everyone in America, because anything that any one of us wants to be able to achieve will only be possible if everyone is brought in to this democracy. And we're beginning to see some good changes in Georgia. As you probably know, there's the New Georgia Project, which is going to ensure that we get those registrations and folks actually out to the polls. In Texas, the Texas Organizing Project. So really from the grassroots, even before you have a new Voting Rights Act, people are taking matters into their own hands and making sure that everyone gets out to the polls.
Let's talk about another critical issue, and that is, again, for you, the state of your campaign. You've been in it for a couple of months now. The pundits say you're lagging in the polls. How do, with so many people in this race, how do you get traction? How do you build that where people then are saying, hey, he has a legitimate shot at this? Or, because you hear people say, you know what? He should have ran for U.S. Senate. He should have stayed in Texas, built folks there, targeted John Cornyn. What do you have to do to gain traction in a field with 23, 24 candidates?
You know, at its best, this race is going to be a competition of ideas. And so this bold proposal that we released yesterday on voting rights and making sure that more people are brought into our democracy, I hope helps to distinguish us. We've also released bold plans on climate change, bold plans on immigration reform. We've talked very passionately about a criminal justice system where we need to reform it by making sure that not only do we end the war on drugs, not only do we do away with for-profit prisons, not only do we end cash bail and expunge the arrest records of those arrested for possession of a substance that's legal in more than half the states in the country right now, but that we go well beyond that and confront the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and suppression that is alive and well in every part of American life today. But I think there are some personal things that might also distinguish me as well. Coming from the U.S.-Mexico border, a community that doesn't just tolerate our differences, but embraces them. One of the safest places in the United States of America today, in El Paso, is safe, not despite, but because we are a city of immigrants. And in this race that we ran last year in Texas, one of the reddest states in America, we went to every single county and brought people in. It didn't matter how rural, how small, how red. We were going to show up with the courage of our convictions, talking about the most important issues, but then bringing you in to this process. And we also didn't take the big blue places for granted either. We showed up there as well and included people in the outcomes of that election. And though I didn't win at the end of the day, we got close. We won more votes than any Democrat had in the history of the state of Texas, won independents for the first time in decades, brought Republicans along as well. And as you know, we now have 2 new members of Congress, in part as a result, both Democrats replacing Republicans, 17 African-American women elected to judicial positions in Harris County. So we were able to help fix our democracy in Texas and bring more people in. I think that's the only way that you beat Trump in 2020. It's the only way that you bring this country back together again in 2021.
One of the areas that is also critically important that I talk about a lot deals with economics, and that is you've got 2.6 million black-owned businesses in America. 2.5 million of those only have one employee. When we had 1.9 million black-owned businesses several years ago, they were doing an average revenue of about $110,000 a year. Today, here we have 700,000 more black-owned businesses, and they're only doing an average revenue of $54,000 a year. And so what will you do to deal with that? Because having black businesses not being able to grow, not being able to have capital, not being able to build capacity has a direct impact on the economic future of African Americans, especially when you talk about wealth creation.
I want to double the amount of money that we have in community finance institutions to get capital into the community so the businesses that you just described can expand and grow, hire, invest in new equipment and technologies, and expand their customer base. I want to make sure that the federal government, through the billions of dollars in procurement decisions that it makes, favors true small businesses and helps specifically minority-owned businesses to expand. One of the legacies that I just described, that I alluded to in terms of slavery and segregation and redlining, is the fact that you've got 10 times the wealth in white America than you do in black America. And this is going to exist and persist and be exacerbated unless you have structural changes in how the government purchases and how capital gets out into communities. So those 2 structural changes in terms of community lending, doubling the amount that we get out there, and procurement decisions from the federal government. And if you match that with a new deduction for small business owners in the tax code, especially these small businesses that you're talking about, I think you begin to get closer to parity, or at least you get people on the path to be able to pursue something closer to parity going forward. Those are 3 concrete steps that we can take.
Let's also sort of stay on that, because when we talk about, again, fostering job growth and job development, when you talk about those dollars, one of the biggest complaints that I've heard from mayors for years is that you've had plans in the past where they said, fine, we'll take the money and then we'll send it to states. Whereas mayors said, hey, wait a minute, we've had better outcomes when it comes to DBA participation, when it comes to African-American businesses. And so I think also a big issue is whoever is president saying, hey, let's bypass these governors and let's say, how do we target money directly to states, to cities, city programs where African Americans have done a lot better than statewide programs?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the real innovation's happening at the city level right now. I was just in Columbia, South Carolina, visiting with Mayor Benjamin. He was telling me about the power of these community development block grants. He was able to use that small federal investment and match it, I think, 9-to-1, and build affordable housing in the city center of Columbia, housing that University of South Carolina students can afford, housing that others who might have otherwise been pushed out of their neighborhoods could afford, because he made developer investment and the zoning that was necessary conditional on affordability. So here you have a mayor who's tackling the crisis in housing affordability in the United States, and that's happening not at the state or the federal level, that's happening at the local level. So let's find those most innovative mayors and city councils, and let's invest in them. Couldn't agree more.
Education is obviously another critically important issue. What is your specific plan for the nation's historically black colleges and universities? Obviously, in Texas, you have institutions that are private. You have Houston-Tillotson in Austin. You also have Wiley College, and you have Paul Quinn there in the Dallas area. And then, of course, your larger ones, TSU in Houston, as well as Prairie View, but also across the country. What is your plan for HBCUs?
I was just fortunate enough to be able to give the commencement at Paul Quinn College last month. And one of the things that I learned from my visits to Paul Quinn is it is the first urban work college in the United States of America. They've been able to reduce the cost of tuition through this program. They've been able to guarantee more of their students jobs right after graduation. And the level of indebtedness is much lower than it was, say, 10 years ago at Paul Quinn College. But we know that HBCUs, because of smaller endowment sizes, have a much larger challenge in being able to make college affordable and prevent students from graduating with $30,000, $40,000, $60,000 in student loan debt. So a greater investment from the federal government in these HBCUs is absolutely critical. Any plan to make sure that we have free community college, that we do a better job of elevating unions and access to apprenticeships, must be combined with an investment in HBCUs, and then the ability to pay down debt affordably. So let's lower the interest rates, and let's absolutely expand the public service loan forgiveness program. If you're willing to work at the VA, teach school, invest part of your life in public service, I want to wipe clean the student loan debt that you carry so that you can focus on your career, your life, and serving others.
Let's talk about, we talk about primary and secondary education. I went to magnet schools in Houston, Jack Hayes High School, Magnet School of Communications. I am a huge supporter of charter schools because for me, I believe in every form of education if it works for the children. And so when it comes to charter schools, which is also an opportunity for African Americans to control schools, run the schools, control the curriculum, control the economics, what is your stance on public charter schools?
So I think there's a role for charter schools for some of the reasons that you just described. But I think that there's not going to be an opportunity to charter our way through all the challenges or opportunities that we have. There's also some really extraordinary public schools in the city in which you were educated. We were visiting Kashmir Gardens after Harvey. And one of the things that the president of the Neighborhood Association told me is that we were hit by a storm long before Harvey. And he talked about just lack of social, educational services, the ability to get a healthy meal, kind of a food desert in that area. And we were passing Kashmir Elementary, and I said, well, this has got to be a poor performing school. And he said, actually, this is really the bright spot in our community. It's a complete school. So not only do you have free and reduced breakfast and lunch, but you have primary and mental health care services at that school, which many kids are unable for whatever reason, perhaps because Texas failed to expand Medicaid, unable to access. But they're able to access them there at that school, world-class public school educators, instructors, and teachers. So I think investing in them, making sure that pre-K is universal across this country, that teachers can focus on just one job because they don't have to work 2 or 3 as they do throughout Texas and too many states in this country right now. That's going to necessitate greater federal investment in programs like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Title I funding. Make sure that those are laboratories for innovation as well. So I think that public education can be foundational to our larger economic success, but we've got to make it a primary focus. And right now it is not.
Well, I got a couple of minutes left. And so when we talk about also how we move forward, I said this to Senator Bernie Sanders, and I've said this to every other white Democrat. I believe that what we're seeing with Donald Trump is we're operating in this age of white fear, that we have individuals who understand the demographic changes in this country. How do you directly talk to white voters to get them to understand that this whole we keep hearing economic anxiety? I think white Democrats have to look white voters in the eye and say, you are being played on racial politics and the fear of the changes in the country. And I think it has to be explicit. It has to be clear. And also, I think white Democrats have to also go to the reddest places in the country and look at white voters in the eye and say, your health care sucks, your economics suck, and guess what? You're being played because you're being played on racial fears. Are you willing to do that, to look white voters in the eye and say, look, stop blaming another ethnicity for what's going on here. The America's changing. You have to accept the reality of what's going on.
Yes, the answer is yes, and that's what I did across Texas, in 2017 and 2018. It's what I've been doing in this presidential campaign, going to Southwest Iowa, for example, and listening to and talking with farmers who are really bearing the brunt of this president's trade policies. I mean, the soybeans, the corn that they're growing can no longer find markets in Asia. If he imposes these tariffs on Mexico, they'll no longer be able to sell there. They're already underwater in debt. They're already underwater from the floods from the Missouri River. This president is absolutely punishing them and distracting them, or at least trying to at the same time, by trying to make them scared of Mexicans, who he calls rapists and criminals, or Muslims, who he wants to ban from this country, or calling Klansmen or white supremacists or neo-Nazis very fine people. And I remind folks that this doesn't just offend our sensibilities. This leads to changed practices in our country. Hate crimes in America up 3 years and counting in a row. You had the mosque in Victoria, Texas, burned to the ground on the day that he signed his Muslim travel ban. You don't put kids in cages until you first describe them as animals or an infestation. So, yes, we talk about that in the places you might expect us to, but we talk about those things in the places you'd least expect us to, in front of all white audiences in rural parts of America. It's the only way that we're going to confront this challenge together and be able to overcome it. And it's going to take all of us. And so, yeah, I want to make sure that we take that message everywhere in this country.
All right, Beto O'Rourke, I appreciate you joining me and Roland Martin Unfiltered. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Very grateful.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Hey, guys, they're back. MarijuanaStock.org has another great investment opportunity. If you were lucky enough to invest in their last crowdfunding campaign, you know they raised a lot of money in just a few months investing in legal marijuana farms. Now, those initial investors now own shares of a publicly traded company. Folks, the last time, again, a lot of y'all missed it. Y'all were emailing me. Oh, what about it? Well, guess what? Now they have a new investment opportunity that is as good, if not even better than last. I'm talking about industrial hemp CBD. Now, for those who don't know, the hemp plant is the cousin to marijuana with a much higher concentration of CBD, which means hemp CBD gives you all of the benefits of marijuana without getting you high. Until recently, hemp farming was practically illegal in the U.S. and heavily regulated by the DEA. However, the 2018 Farm Bill changed all of that, making it legal to grow hemp CBD in the U.S. and creating one of the largest commodities worldwide. They need land to grow all of the plants. This makes for an incredible investment opportunity, and that's where our good friends at 420 Real Estate come in. Now, first of all, they're black. I'm saying that because a lot of African Americans are not in. Now, we were hurt by marijuana laws, and now white folks are benefiting financially from the change to those very laws. Well, the business model of 420 Real Estate is simple. They buy land that supports hemp CBD grow operations and lease it to licensed, high-paying tenants. That's right, they are hemp CBD landlords. And you can get in on the action. You can invest in this crowdfunding campaign for as little as $200 up to $10,000. Like I said, I'm not missing out on this, and neither should you. You should invest. Go to marijuanastock.org, marijuanastock.org. You can get in the game and get in the game now. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.